Teresa Halbach woke up early on Halloween morning, her small apartment bathed in the warm autumn light filtering through the curtains. Her calendar was full, as it often was for a freelance photographer. She glanced at her schedule while sipping a quick cup of coffee. Today would be busy, but routine, or so it seemed. Her roommate, Lisa, poked her head into the kitchen. "Long day ahead?" she asked, noticing the stack of assignment papers Teresa was organizing. "Yeah, Avery salvage yard is on the list again," Teresa replied, her tone betraying a hint of reluctance. "It's nothing. I just get this weird vibe whenever I go there," Lisa frowned. "You don't have to go, you know." Teresa shrugged. "It's part of the job. I'll be fine." She grabbed her camera bag, double-checked her phone, and headed out. The brisk air carried the scent of damp leaves as Teresa drove her blue Toyota RAV4 through the winding rural roads of Manitowoc County. The landscape was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the occasional truck passing by. As she approached the entrance to the Avery salvage yard, the sky began to gray, casting long shadows over the rows of rusting vehicles. Teresa parked near the main office, her engine's hum fading into silence. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at her phone to confirm the address. As she stepped out of the car, Steven Avery appeared from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. His greeting was casual, almost overly friendly. "Hey, Teresa," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made her uneasy. "Thanks for coming." She nodded politely and focused on her work, snapping pictures of the minivan that needed to be listed for sale. The job was straightforward, but Teresa couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched. Her every move felt scrutinized. Steven stood at a distance, his gaze unwavering. "Do you always come out here alone?" he asked, suddenly breaking the silence. The question was casual, but it sent a chill through her. Teresa forced a smile. "It's just part of the job," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. A brief, awkward silence followed before Steven turned and walked back toward the garage. Teresa exhaled slowly, relieved to be left alone. She quickly finished her work, packed up her camera, and headed back to her car. As she was about to start the engine, she noticed something in her rearview mirror. A figure standing just at the edge of the yard, partially hidden among the wreckage. Her pulse quickened. Was it her imagination? Shaking off the uneasy feeling, Teresa pulled out of the yard, her tires crunching over the gravel. She made a mental note to call Lisa once she was on the main road, but before she could, her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment she hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the faint sound of breathing. Then the line went dead. Teresa stared at the screen, a sense of dread washing over her. She glanced in the rearview mirror again, her heart racing as she thought she saw movement in the distance. But the road behind her was empty. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every shadow, every sound seemed amplified. When she finally pulled into her driveway, Teresa sat in her car for a moment, trying to shake the feeling of unease. She laughed at herself, trying to dismiss the tension as paranoia. After all, it was just another assignment, wasn't it? As she stepped inside her apartment, Lisa looked up from the couch. "You're home early," she said, her tone laced with surprise. Teresa managed a small smile. "Yeah, it was quicker than I thought," she lied, keeping the growing anxiety buried beneath the surface. Lisa didn't press further, and Teresa retreated to her room, setting her camera bag on the desk. She stared at her phone, the unknown number lingering on the screen. Something about today didn't feel right, but she couldn't put her finger on it. "Just tired," she whispered to herself, shutting off the light. Little did she know the shadows of Halloween would haunt her long after the night was over. The morning after Halloween, Teresa Halbach's phone alarm buzzed, its persistent chime cutting through the stillness of her bedroom. But the sound went unanswered. Her roommate, Lisa, assumed Teresa had already left for an early job. Yet, as hours passed and Teresa failed to check in, unease crept in like a shadow over the apartment. Lisa tried calling her, but the line went straight to voicemail. "Hey, Teresa, just checking in. Call me when you get this, okay?" she said, attempting to sound casual. Deep down, however, a gnawing worry had already taken hold. By late afternoon, Teresa's parents also noticed something was wrong. She hadn't called or texted, which was unusual for their daughter, who always made a point to check in after completing her assignments. The realization that nobody had heard from her since the previous day sent shockwaves through the family. Her father, Tom Halbach, paced their living room with the phone pressed tightly to his ear. She didn't say anything unusual last time we talked, he told Lisa. It's just not like her to disappear. Lisa, trying to keep calm, responded. She mentioned the Avery salvage yard. That was one of her stops yesterday. Tom's heart sank. He had heard Teresa mention the yard before, always with a slight edge to her voice, as if the place unsettled her. He immediately contacted the police, his voice trembling as he described the situation. Something's wrong, he insisted. You have to find her. The Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office quickly launched an investigation, focusing on Teresa's last known whereabouts. Detectives traced her schedule and confirmed her final assignment at Steven Avery's property. A team was dispatched to the salvage yard, its sprawling maze of rusted cars and scrap metal, now an ominous labyrinth holding potential answers. Steven Avery met the officers with an air of nonchalance. Yeah, she was here, he admitted, leaning against a workbench. She took pictures of the van and left. That's all I know. But his demeanor did little to reassure the investigators. Something about his casual tone felt rehearsed, too smooth, too convenient. They pressed further, asking if anyone else had been on the property that day. Steven shrugged. Just me and my nephew Brendan. It was a normal day. Detectives weren't convinced. They began a search of the yard, starting with the area near the office where Teresa's car had been seen last. Hours into the operation, one of the officers shouted, "Got something!" His voice echoed across the yard. Tucked away under a pile of branches and debris was Teresa's blue Toyota RAV4. The discovery sent a chill through the team. The car's windows were streaked with smudges, and the license plates had been removed. Inside, traces of blood glistened faintly under the flashlight beams. It was a grim confirmation that something terrible had happened. News of the discovery spread quickly, drawing reporters and curious locals to the salvage yard's perimeter. Cameramen jostled for a view while journalists delivered breaking updates, their voices urgent and grave. Authorities have located the missing photographer's vehicle, one anchor reported. Details remain scarce, but investigators believe foul play may be involved. Meanwhile, Teresa's family clung to hope, their faith growing increasingly fragile with each passing hour. We just want her home, her mother whispered through tears during a televised plea. If anyone knows anything, please come forward. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the salvage yard, detectives made another chilling discovery. Near the garage, they found a burn pit scattered with charred fragments. The acrid smell of ash lingered in the air, and among the debris were pieces of what appeared to be human remains. A camera lens and a phone casing were also recovered, their blackened edges telling a story of violence and concealment. The air grew thick with tension as officers secured the area and prepared to expand their search. For Teresa's family, the discovery deepened their worst fears. For the investigators, it was clear this was no ordinary missing persons case. Darkness had fallen over Manitowoc County, and the road to truth would be long and harrowing. The following morning, the Manitowoc County salvage yard was eerily quiet, its usual sounds of grinding metal replaced by the hushed murmurs of investigators. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area near Steven Avery's garage, marking the spot where the burn pit had been uncovered. The air carried the acrid scent of ash, a grim reminder of the gruesome discovery made the night before. Detective Mark Weigert crouched near the pit, his flashlight illuminating charred fragments that barely resembled anything human. A forensic specialist knelt beside him, carefully placing each fragment into evidence bags. "It's definitely bone," the specialist confirmed, her voice subdued. "Some of it appears to be human." The weight of her words settled heavily over the scene. Weigert stood and signaled to his team. "We need to expand the search area," he instructed. "This isn't just a crime scene, it's a graveyard." As investigators combed through the salvage yard, Steven Avery sat inside his home sipping coffee and staring out the window. His expression was unreadable. When officers approached to escort him to the station for questioning, he didn't resist. "I already told you," he said flatly. "I didn't do anything. You're wasting your time." At the station, Avery's calm demeanor began to fray under scrutiny. Detectives laid out the evidence, the blood in Teresa's car, the burn pit, and now the fragments of bone. "That's her out there," Weigert said, his voice heavy with accusation. "And you expect us to believe you had nothing to do with it?" Avery leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Believe what you want. I'm being set up." Meanwhile, at the crime scene, a discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. Among the charred remains were pieces of Teresa's personal belongings, the melted casing of her cell phone, a camera lens warped by heat, and scraps of her clothing. Each item told a story of violence and an attempt to erase its traces. The findings were devastating for Teresa's family. Her father, Tom, arrived at the sheriff's office, his face pale with anguish. "Is it her?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. "We're still confirming," Weigert replied cautiously. "But the evidence, it's pointing that way." Back at the yard, forensic experts continued their meticulous work. The bone fragments were carefully packed and sent to the lab for analysis. The specialists worked in near silence, their focus unshakable despite the grim task before them. One piece of evidence, however, raised troubling questions. A large bone fragment that appeared too intact to have been burned entirely in the pit. Could it have been moved there after the fact? The public, too, was reeling from the news. Reporters camped outside the salvage yard, their live updates delivering shocking details to an increasingly captivated audience. Authorities have uncovered what appears to be human remains in a burn pit behind Steven Avery's home, one anchor announced solemnly. The investigation is intensifying as questions mount about how and why this could have happened. As night fell, the yard seemed to hold its breath. The investigators were packing up for the evening when one of them spotted something unusual near the edge of the property, a second, smaller burn site. "Over here," he called, waving his flashlight. The team hurried over, their initial dread giving way to confusion. The site contained additional bone fragments, but their condition and placement suggested they had been burned elsewhere before being dumped. The revelation deepened the mystery. If this wasn't the primary site, then where had the burning occurred? And more importantly, who had moved the remains? These questions hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. For Teresa's family, the wait for answers was unbearable. They clung to each other, their grief mingled with a desperate hope for justice. For the investigators, the case had taken a darker turn, with evidence pointing to a crime more calculated than they had initially imagined. And for Steven Avery, the walls seemed to be closing in, but his claims of innocence added a layer of uncertainty no one could ignore. Brendan Dassey sat at the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the beige wall of his small room. The hum of the television in the living room barely registered in his mind as his thoughts churned. It had been days since the police first arrived at his Uncle Steven's property, and the tension in their family home had become unbearable. Brendan's mother, Barb, noticed his quiet demeanor, but brushed it off as his usual withdrawn nature. In the kitchen, Barb leaned over the counter, phone pressed to her ear. "He's just a kid," she told the officer on the other end. "He doesn't know anything." Her voice cracked slightly. "You're barking up the wrong tree." But the officer was insistent. Brendan's name had come up during the investigation, and they needed to talk to him. Reluctantly, Barb agreed to bring her son to the station. Brendan, overhearing the conversation, felt his stomach knot. He didn't understand why they wanted to talk to him, but deep down, a part of him feared he already knew. The next day, Brendan found himself sitting in a stark, fluorescent-lit room at the police station. Across the table, two detectives leaned forward, their voices low and steady. "Brendan, we just want to know what happened that day," one of them said. "You were at Steven's house, weren't you?" Brendan nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, I was there," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The detectives exchanged a quick glance. "Okay, good," the other detective said. "Now, did you see Teresa Halbach that day?" Brendan's heart pounded. He thought of Teresa's car, the eerie quiet of the salvage yard, and his uncle's cryptic remarks. But he also thought of his family, the loyalty he felt toward his mother and Steven. "No," he whispered. "I didn't see her." The questioning continued, the detectives gently but persistently prodding. Brendan's responses were halting, inconsistent, his words were peppered with nervous pauses, and his gaze darted around the room, avoiding eye contact. "Did Steven ever say anything about her?" one detective asked. Brendan hesitated for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he stammered, He told me to stay away from the garage." The detective seized on this. "Why would he tell you that, Brendan? What was in the garage?" "I don't know," Brendan replied, his voice rising slightly. "I didn't go in there." The tension in the room was palpable. Brendan was visibly uncomfortable, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The detectives pressed on, their tone shifting from gentle inquiry to thinly veiled accusation. "Brendan, we know something happened. If you don't tell us the truth, we can't help you." Tears welled in Brendan's eyes as the weight of their words bore down on him. He didn't want to betray his uncle, but the fear of being caught in a lie overwhelmed him. Finally, he broke down. "He told me to help him," Brendan sobbed, his words tumbling out in a torrent. He said we had to get rid of her. The detectives leaned closer, their voices steady but firm. What did he mean by that, Brendan? What did you do? Brendan's confession was disjointed, filled with contradictions and gaps. He spoke of the burn pit, of being told to carry something heavy, of standing silently as his uncle worked. I didn't do anything to her, Brendan said desperately. I just did what he told me to do. The detectives pushed further, trying to pin down the details. But Brendan's answers were vague, often changing under scrutiny. It became clear that his account was unreliable, shaped as much by fear and confusion as by memory. Yet his words added a chilling layer to the case, a glimpse into a possible collaboration, coerced or otherwise. When Brendan left the station, his mother was waiting for him, her face pale and drawn. What did you tell them? She demanded. Brendan couldn't meet her eyes. I didn't mean to say anything bad, he murmured. They just kept asking. Barb's anger dissolved into worry as she realized the enormity of what her son had been drawn into. It's going to be okay, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She pulled Brendan into a tight hug, her mind racing with questions and fears. As they drove home, Brendan stared out the window, the landscape blurring past him. He felt a crushing sense of guilt, not just for what he had said, but for the secrets he had kept. In his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. The tension in the Avery salvage yard had reached a boiling point. Detectives armed with search warrants scoured every corner of the property, determined to uncover more evidence. Steven Avery, now firmly in their sights, watched from the doorway of his trailer, his arms crossed and face taut with defiance. Inside, investigators combed through Avery's bedroom meticulously. Drawers were emptied, mattress seams were inspected, and even the smallest crevices were not spared. Hours into the search, an officer called out from near the bedside table. Got something? He said, holding up a single car key dangling from a plain metal ring. Detective Mark Weigert stepped closer, inspecting the discovery. It's for a Toyota, the officer confirmed. The room fell silent. Everyone knew Teresa Halbach drove a Toyota RAV4. Weigert's expression darkened. Bag it and get it tested, he ordered. The key was carefully placed into an evidence bag, but its sudden appearance raised immediate questions among the team. They had searched this room twice before. How had such a critical piece of evidence gone unnoticed? Word of the discovery spread quickly. Prosecutor Ken Kratz held an impromptu press conference, declaring the key a breakthrough. This key is directly linked to Teresa Halbach's vehicle, he announced. Its presence in Steven Avery's bedroom is another significant piece of evidence connecting him to the crime. But the announcement did not go unchallenged. Steven Avery's defense team wasted no time raising doubts about the circumstances. Dean Strang, one of Avery's attorneys, spoke with reporters outside the courthouse. It's curious, isn't it? He began. This key wasn't found during the first two searches, and yet here it is now, miraculously appearing in plain sight. Inside the courthouse, Steven Avery remained unyielding. During questioning, he scoffed at the discovery. They planted it, he said firmly, his voice laced with frustration. They want me to look guilty. The public reaction was swift and divided. Supporters of Avery rallied behind his claims of a setup, pointing to his ongoing lawsuit against Manitowoc County as a motive for the alleged framing. Others saw the key as damning evidence, another nail in the coffin for a man already steeped in suspicion. At the crime lab, forensic technicians examined the key meticulously. Teresa's DNA was found on the metal surface, further strengthening the case against Avery. However, questions about the chain of custody lingered, creating an undercurrent of doubt even among the investigators. Had someone tampered with the evidence? Meanwhile, Brendan Dassey, unaware of the latest developments, sat quietly at home. His mother, Barb, paced the living room, her nerves frayed. This isn't right, she muttered. They're twisting everything. Barb's unease deepened as she recalled Brendan's recent questioning. Had her son been drawn into something far more sinister than she could comprehend? Her thoughts were interrupted by the evening news, where the discovery of the key was being analyzed in excruciating detail. Investigators believe the key solidifies their case, the anchor reported. However, the defense is raising concerns about the timing and validity of the evidence. The conflicting narratives created a storm of speculation. Was this the key to unraveling the truth, or another layer in a web of manipulation? For the investigators, it was a pivotal piece of the puzzle. For the defense, it was a glaring red flag. As the day ended, the salvage yard fell into an uneasy silence once more. Under the cold fluorescent lights of the evidence room, the key sat encased in its bag, a small object carrying the weight of an entire case. Outside, the winds of Manitowoc County howled, as if whispering secrets no one could yet decipher. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the forensic expert took the stand, the weight of her testimony pressing down on the atmosphere like a storm cloud. Her findings on the bone fragments, the bullet, and Teresa Halbach's DNA were crucial, potentially sealing Steven Avery's fate. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, her voice steady but carrying a heavy burden. The DNA on the bullet found in Mr. Avery's garage matches Teresa Halbach's profile, she began. Additionally, the bone fragments recovered from the burn pit exhibit characteristics consistent with remains exposed to extreme heat. In the defense's corner, Dean Strang scribbled notes furiously. Something about the findings didn't sit right with him. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he stood and approached the witness stand, his tone calm but probing. "Can you confirm whether these fragments were burned in the pit where they were found?" The expert hesitated before answering. While the fragments were recovered there, the level of charring suggests they may have been burned elsewhere and later transported. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Strang pressed on. "So you're saying the burn pit may not have been the primary location?" "It's possible," she admitted. The implication was chilling. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, their voices competing to break the latest twist. If the burn pit wasn't the original site, one anchor speculated, it raises questions about who else might have been involved, or if the evidence was manipulated. Meanwhile, Brendan Dassey's mother, Barb, sat in her living room, clutching the remote with trembling hands. The broadcast amplified her growing fears. Brendan had confessed to helping Steven, but his account was riddled with contradictions. Now the forensic evidence added another layer of doubt. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How did we get here?" Back at the Avery salvage yard, the search continued. A second burn site had been discovered days earlier, further complicating the timeline. This area, smaller and less conspicuous, yielded fragments that didn't fully match those from the primary pit. Investigators theorized that it could have been used as a dumping ground, a final effort to erase Teresa's existence. But there was more. Near the edge of the yard, detectives stumbled upon an abandoned trailer. Inside, they found a tattered journal, its pages filled with fragmented thoughts and scribbles. At first glance, it seemed unrelated, but one entry stood out, a cryptic note about watching her leave and a chilling phrase, "She'll never tell anyone now." The handwriting was inconsistent, as if written by multiple people. The discovery reignited speculation. Was this another piece of the puzzle, or an unrelated coincidence? The pages were bagged and sent for analysis, though their origin remained a mystery. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution introduced a video of Brendan Dassey's interrogation. The footage showed the boy slumped in his chair, his words hesitant as he described helping Steven dispose of Teresa's body. The details were gruesome, but his tone lacked conviction. "How much of this is real?" Strang muttered under his breath as he watched the screen. Brendan's statements seemed coached, each response shaped by the detective's leading questions. The video ended, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. In the days that followed, tensions reached a fever pitch. Supporters of Steven Avery rallied outside the courthouse, holding signs that read "Free Steven" and "Justice for Teresa." Opposing groups clashed, their shouts echoing through the cold Manitowoc air. The case had become more than a murder trial. It was a battle of narratives, each side convinced of their truth. As night fell, Detective Weigert sat at his desk staring at the evidence board. The photos, maps, and notes formed a chaotic collage, but one detail gnawed at him: the second burn site. If the remains had been moved, it meant someone else knew more than they were letting on. "We're missing something," he muttered to himself. The secrets of that Halloween night lingered in the shadows, refusing to come fully into the light. And for every answer the investigation uncovered, new questions seemed to rise in their place. Brendan Dassey sat in the small interrogation room, the fluorescent lights above casting a harsh glow on his pale face. His hands rested awkwardly on the table, fingers twitching slightly. Across from him sat two detectives, their expressions a blend of patience and determination. The silence in the room was suffocating. "We're here to help you, Brendan," one of them said, his voice soft but insistent. "We know this has been hard on you, but we need you to be honest with us. About everything." Brendan nodded slightly, his gaze fixed on the table. He didn't dare look up, didn't dare meet their eyes. The weight of their expectations pressed down on him like an iron fist. He wasn't sure what they wanted to hear, but the unspoken pressure to deliver it was overwhelming. "Let's start with the night Teresa was last seen," the second detective said, leaning forward. "You were at Steven's place, right?" "Yeah," Brendan murmured. His voice was barely audible. "What happened that night?" Brendan hesitated. He thought about the burn pit, about the faint glow of the fire against the dark sky. He thought about Steven's orders, his uncle's sharp tone leaving little room for argument, but he also thought about his family, about how his words might tear them apart. "I don't know," he finally said. "I didn't see anything." The detectives exchanged a quick glance. "Brendan," one of them began, his tone shifting, "we already know some of what happened. We've got evidence, and it's not looking good for Steven. But if you tell us the truth, you can help yourself. You don't want to go down for something you didn't do, right?" Brendan's heart raced. Their words were a lifeline and a trap all at once. He struggled to find the right response, but the fear of getting it wrong paralyzed him. "I don't know," he repeated, his voice cracking. One of the detectives sighed. "Brendan, we need to know about the fire. You were there, weren't you? Did Steven say anything to you about Teresa?" Brendan's mind raced. Flashes of that night coming back to him in disjointed fragments. He remembered Steven calling for him, the way the flames danced in the pit, the metallic smell that clung to the air. He remembered feeling like he didn't belong there, like he should have run away, but he stayed. "He said to help him," Brendan whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "He told me to get some stuff, to throw in the fire." The room went still. "What kind of stuff, Brendan?" one detective asked, his voice almost a whisper. Brendan shook his head, his tears spilling over. "I don't know, just stuff. I didn't look at it." "But you helped him, right?" the detective pressed. "You carried things to the fire?" Brendan nodded reluctantly. "Yeah, but I didn't do anything to her. I swear I didn't." The detectives leaned back, their expressions unreadable. Brendan's confession was fragmented, incomplete, but it painted a picture they couldn't ignore. It was enough to solidify the narrative they were building against Steven Avery, and by extension, Brendan himself. When Brendan was finally allowed to leave the room, he felt hollow. His mother, Barb, was waiting for him in the hallway, her face a mask of worry. "What did you tell them?" she asked, her voice trembling. Brendan couldn't meet her gaze. "I just told them what they wanted to hear," he mumbled. Barb's heart sank. She pulled him into a tight hug, but her mind raced with panic. She didn't know what Brendan had said, but she could feel the walls closing in around them. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, though she didn't believe it herself. As they drove home, the landscape blurred past them, the heavy silence between them punctuated only by the hum of the engine. Brendan stared out the window, his mind a whirlwind of fear and regret. He had tried to do what was right, or at least what he thought was right. But deep down he knew the truth. Whatever he had said in that room, it wouldn't be enough to save him. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled with reporters, family members, and spectators eager to witness the trial of Steven Avery. The air was thick with tension, an undercurrent of anticipation rippling through the crowd. This was no ordinary trial. It was a spectacle, a fight for truth wrapped in layers of mystery and controversy. Steven Avery sat at the defense table, his expression stoic but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. Beside him, Dean Strang and Jerry Buting, his attorneys, exchanged hushed whispers as they prepared for the day's proceedings. Across the room, the prosecution team, led by Ken Kratz, exuded confidence. The case they had built was strong, bolstered by a mountain of forensic evidence in Brendan Dassey's confession. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom fell silent as the judge entered. The trial was officially underway. Kratz opened with a fiery statement painting Avery as a manipulative predator who had lured Teresa Halbach to his property under the guise of a photography job. He detailed the evidence: the blood in Teresa's car, the burn pit, the key found in Avery's bedroom. Each point was delivered with precision, each word a hammer driving nails into Avery's defense. But Strang was ready. When it was his turn to address the jury, he methodically dismantled the prosecution's narrative, casting doubt on the integrity of the investigation. "This is not about guilt or innocence," he began, his voice steady but firm. "It's about a system that has failed, a system willing to sacrifice Steven Avery to cover its own mistakes." The first witnesses took the stand: forensic experts, police officers, and medical examiners. Each testimony was scrutinized, dissected by the opposing counsel. When the DNA analyst confirmed that Teresa's blood matched the stains in her car, the courtroom was heavy with silence. But Strang seized the moment during cross-examination. "Isn't it true," he asked, that the blood sample in evidence was previously opened, that it had a puncture mark inconsistent with standard handling? The analyst hesitated. Yes, that's true, she admitted. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Kratz countered with his next witness, a detective who had discovered Teresa's key in Avery's bedroom. The testimony was damning until Budding began his cross-examination. You searched this room multiple times before finding the key, correct? He asked, his tone sharp. That's correct, the detective replied. And during those initial searches you found nothing? Budding pressed. Nothing, the detective admitted reluctantly. Interesting, Budding remarked, letting the implication hang in the air. The most explosive moment came when the prosecution played Brendan Dassey's interrogation video. The footage showed Brendan, visibly nervous, recounting how he and Avery had burned Teresa's body. The details were horrifying and many in the audience turned away, unable to watch. But as the defense replayed parts of the video, focusing on the detective's leading questions, a different picture emerged. Did you see how they fed him the answers? Strang asked during a break. This isn't a confession, it's a script. As the trial continued, emotions ran high. Teresa's family sat quietly, their grief etched on their faces. Outside the courthouse, protesters clashed, their signs and chants reflecting the deep divide in public opinion. Some demanded justice for Teresa, while others called for Avery's freedom, claiming he was a scapegoat for a corrupt system. Inside, the tension reached a boiling point during Kratz's closing argument. Steven Avery is a dangerous man, he declared, his voice ringing through the room. The evidence is clear, the motive undeniable. He took Teresa Halbach's life, and he must be held accountable. Strang's rebuttal was just as powerful. This case is riddled with doubt, he argued, his tone unwavering. From the handling of evidence to the coercion of a vulnerable teenager, everything about this investigation screams injustice. As the jury was dismissed to deliberate, the courtroom emptied, leaving behind an air of uncertainty. For Avery, the wait was agonizing. For Teresa's family, it was another step toward closure, or so they hoped. And for the public, it was a spectacle that had only just begun to reveal its darkest secrets. The Avery family sat in the small, dimly lit kitchen, the air thick with tension. Barb Dassey paced back and forth, her voice trembling as she addressed her brother Steven, who sat at the table, his arms crossed tightly. Brendan lingered by the door, his eyes downcast, as if trying to disappear into the shadows. You have no idea what they've done to Brendan, Barb shouted, her voice cracking. He's just a kid, Steven. He doesn't even understand what's happening. And now they're dragging him into this nightmare. Steven's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the worn tabletop. I didn't do anything, Barb, he said firmly. And Brendan didn't either. They're making him say things that aren't true. Barb stopped pacing and turned to face her brother, her hands shaking. But why, Steven? Why are they coming after us? Why Brendan? Steven looked up, his eyes hard but filled with frustration. Because they want to destroy us. It's about my lawsuit. This is payback, plain and simple. In the corner, Brendan shifted uncomfortably. The words hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Barb sighed deeply, her anger giving way to despair. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. This family is falling apart, she whispered. At the courthouse, the tension was no less palpable. Teresa Halbach's family sat quietly in the front row of the gallery, their grief a constant, silent presence. Her brother Mike clenched his fists as he listened to the latest testimony, the raw pain of losing his sister etched into his face. On the stand, a forensic analyst detailed the inconsistencies in the evidence handling, a point the defense seized upon with fervor. But for Teresa's family, these technicalities meant little. They wanted answers, closure, and justice for Teresa. Outside the courthouse, the growing crowd of protesters reflected the stark divisions within the community. Signs demanding justice for Teresa clashed with those proclaiming free Steven. Heated arguments broke out among strangers, their voices echoing in the chilly Wisconsin air. The case had transcended its courtroom walls, becoming a battleground for broader questions of fairness, corruption, and truth. As the trial progressed, cracks began to show within the Avery family itself. During a tense exchange on the witness stand, one of Steven's siblings expressed doubts about his innocence, a moment that rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. I want to believe he didn't do it, the sibling said, their voice trembling. But sometimes I just don't know. The statement sent shockwaves through the gallery, and Steven's attorneys visibly winced. For the prosecution, it was a moment of triumph. For the defense, it was another hurdle in an already uphill battle. That evening, Brendan sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling. The words of the detectives played over and over in his mind, blending with his mother's pleas and his uncle's denials. He felt like a rope being pulled in two directions, unraveling strand by strand. Meanwhile, Barb sat in the living room, tears streaming down her face as she watched the evening news. The anchor's voice was steady and somber. "The Avery case continues to divide Manitowoc County," he reported. "New testimony has further complicated the trial, leaving many to wonder, will the truth ever come out?" Barb clenched her fists, a mixture of anger and helplessness coursing through her. Her family was unraveling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "This isn't right," she muttered. "None of this is right." Back at the salvage yard, Steven sat alone, staring out the window into the dark expanse of his property. He thought of Teresa, of Brendan, of his family, and of the system he believed had betrayed him. "They're trying to break us," he whispered to himself, "but I won't let them." The Avery family was fractured, their bonds strained under the weight of accusations, doubts, and the relentless march of the trial. For Teresa's family, the pain of loss was compounded by the slow, agonizing process of seeking justice. And for the public, the case was no longer about a single crime. It was about whose story they believed. The courtroom was filled with a tense, almost suffocating silence as the jury filed back into their seats. Every step they took seemed to echo, the sound amplifying the collective anticipation. Steven Avery sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the judge, while his defense attorneys, Dean Strang and Jerry Buting, sat on either side of him, their faces grim but composed. Across the aisle, Teresa Halbach's family leaned forward in their seats, their grief etched into every line of their faces. For them, this was not just a verdict. It was the culmination of months of anguish and unanswered questions. The weight of what was about to be spoken pressed heavily on everyone in the room. "All rise," the bailiff commanded, and the gallery stood as the judge addressed the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A man in the front row stood, the foreperson of the jury, holding a piece of paper in his trembling hands. "We have, Your Honor," he replied, his voice steady but low. The judge nodded and instructed the bailiff to retrieve the paper. As the verdict was handed over, the judge's expression remained neutral, a mask of professionalism that betrayed none of the emotions swirling through the room. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Steven Avery, guilty of first-degree intentional homicide," the judge read aloud. The words reverberated like a gunshot, eliciting a collective gasp from the gallery. Teresa's mother began to sob quietly, her tears a mixture of sorrow and relief. Her brother placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his own face a portrait of restrained emotion. At the defense table, Steven's head dipped slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. Dean Strang leaned in and whispered something to him, but Steven didn't respond. His shoulders stiffened, his gaze fixed on the table before him. The judge continued, his voice steady. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room, the finality of the sentence sinking in. Outside the courthouse, the divided crowd of protesters erupted. Cheers of victory from one side clashed with angry shouts of injustice from the other. Signs declaring justice for Teresa were hoisted high, while others proclaiming "Free Steven Avery" were met with derision. Back inside, the court moved swiftly to Brendan Dassey's verdict. Though his defense team had argued that his confession was coerced, the jury found him guilty of first-degree intentional homicide as well. The young man sat frozen, his face blank as if he didn't fully grasp what had just happened. His mother, Barb, let out a wail, her pain cutting through the tense atmosphere. As the gallery began to empty, Teresa's family remained seated, their emotions raw and conflicting. Relief that the trial had ended mingled with the unshakable sorrow of knowing nothing would ever bring her back. Outside, cameras flashed, reporters scrambled to deliver updates, and the story continued to unfold in the court of public opinion. Steven Avery, now in custody, turned to Strang as they walked out of the courtroom. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "They wanted this," he said. "It doesn't matter what's true anymore." Strang didn't reply. His own thoughts were a whirlwind of frustration and exhaustion. The trial had exposed cracks in the justice system that would haunt him long after the case was over. The verdict, while final in the eyes of the law, left behind a trail of doubt, outrage, and unanswered questions. Teresa Halbach's family hoped this was the end of their nightmare, but for many others, the battle over what really happened had only just begun. The verdicts were in, but the reverberations of the Avery case had only begun to ripple through Manitowoc County. and beyond. Days after the sentencing, the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing. News vans lined the streets outside the courthouse and nightly broadcasts dissected every moment of the trial. Yet, amid the noise, deeper questions began to surface, whispered among locals and amplified by a growing chorus online. In a quiet diner on the outskirts of Manitowoc, two longtime residents sipped coffee and debated the case. "I don't know," one said, shaking his head. "Something doesn't sit right with me. That key, it just showing up like that? After all those searches?" "Yeah," the other replied, his voice low. "And the blood in her car. What if someone planted it? Avery's lawsuit had a lot of people nervous. Maybe they wanted him out of the way." Across town, Dean Strang and Jerry Buting pored over post-trial documents in their office. The defense team's exhaustion was palpable, but their determination remained intact. Strang leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "The inconsistencies in the evidence handling, they're glaring," he said. "The punctured blood vial, the key. We have to keep pushing." Budding nodded. "And Brendan's confession? It was a travesty. Those detectives led him every step of the way. The video speaks for itself." Their frustration mirrored the sentiments of many who had followed the case. The Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer, had just been announced, and its promise to expose systemic flaws in the justice system drew widespread attention. Within days of its release, the series ignited a firestorm of debate, dividing viewers into staunch supporters and vehement critics. For Teresa Halbach's family, the renewed focus on the case was bittersweet. While the documentary brought Teresa's story to a global audience, it also dredged up painful memories and cast doubt on the justice they had fought so hard to secure. "This isn't about Steven Avery or Brendan Dassey," her brother Mike said in a rare interview. "It's about Teresa. It's about what happened to her and the life that was stolen." Yet the documentary also unearthed new allegations that could not be ignored. A former Avery salvage yard employee came forward claiming he had seen law enforcement officers on the property before the key was found. His statement sent shockwaves through the community, raising the specter of evidence tampering once again. At the same time, a forensic pathologist publicly questioned the burn pit evidence. "The remains don't align with a single burn site," she stated in a televised interview. "This suggests the body may have been moved, possibly multiple times." Her remarks deepened suspicions of a broader conspiracy, fueling theories that the true story had yet to be revealed. Steven Avery, now incarcerated, remained defiant. In a letter to his supporters, he wrote, "The truth will come out. They can't keep hiding it forever." His words resonated with many who believed he had been framed, but for others, they were the desperate plea of a guilty man. As public opinion polarized further, Manitowoc County became a microcosm of the broader societal divide. Families argued over dinner tables, friendships were strained, and local officials faced increasing scrutiny. The once quiet community now carried the weight of a national controversy, its streets echoing with the unresolved questions of a case that refused to fade. In the dim light of her living room, Barb Dassey sat clutching a framed photo of Brendan as a child. The boy in the picture was carefree, his smile wide and innocent. Barb's tears fell onto the glass as she whispered, "What did they do to you, Brendan? What did they make you say?" For the Avery and Dassey families, the nightmare seemed endless. Every new allegation, every piece of evidence scrutinized anew only deepened the wounds. For Teresa Halbach's loved ones, the trial's conclusion had brought no solace, only a painful reminder of what had been lost. And for the public, the case had become something larger, a reflection of their own doubts and fears about a system that could so easily decide the fate of a man, a boy, and a grieving family. The echoes of doubt lingered, unanswered, demanding a truth that remained frustratingly out of reach. Years after the trials ended, the Avery salvage yard stood as a desolate reminder of the events that had unraveled there. Rusting cars stretched across the property, their silent forms bearing witness to the countless hours investigators had spent searching for answers. The wind whispered through the debris, carrying with it the weight of unanswered questions and unrelenting controversy. For Teresa Halbach's family, the pain of her loss had not diminished. Her parents, Tom and Karen, established a foundation in her memory, dedicated to supporting victims of violent crime. At a candlelight vigil held on what would have been Teresa's 40th birthday, Tom spoke to a small crowd gathered to honor her life. "She was a light in this world," he said, his voice trembling. "And though that light was taken from us too soon, we will continue to shine it forward for others. That's what Teresa would have wanted." But even as they sought to move forward, The shadow of doubt surrounding the case loomed large. The Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer, had thrust the story into the global spotlight, sparking debates that persisted long after the credits rolled. Online forums buzzed with theories, each more elaborate than the last, while podcasts dissected every piece of evidence, every testimony, and every alleged misstep in the investigation. Steven Avery, from his cell, remained steadfast in proclaiming his innocence. His letters to supporters painted a picture of a man wronged by a corrupt system, a narrative that resonated with many who had come to view him as a victim rather than a perpetrator. "They can lock me up, but they can't bury the truth," one letter read. "One day they'll see I didn't do this." For Brendan Dassey, the years behind bars had been marked by a quiet despair. Now a young man, he carried the burden of a confession he barely understood at the time he gave it. His attorneys continued to fight for his release, arguing that his rights had been violated during the interrogation process. Appeals were filed, rejected, and refiled, each legal battle a painful reminder of the uphill fight for justice. Back in Manitowoc County, the legacy of the case had left scars on the community itself. Former friends no longer spoke, divided by their beliefs about Avery's guilt or innocence. Local businesses avoided discussing the case entirely, knowing it could ignite heated arguments among customers. What had once been a quiet Midwestern town was now synonymous with controversy, its name forever linked to one of the most polarizing cases in modern history. Detective Mark Weigert, retired now, reflected on the investigation during an interview for a crime documentary years later. "There are things I wish we'd done differently," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But at the time, we thought we were doing the right thing. I still believe Teresa deserves justice. I just hope we got it right." And yet the case continued to evolve. In recent years, new forensic technologies promised to re-examine the evidence with greater accuracy. Old DNA samples were tested again, and though the results largely confirmed the original findings, whispers of potential contamination persisted. For every answer, another question seemed to emerge, keeping the story alive in the public consciousness. The Halbach family, weary of the endless speculation, chose to focus on the future rather than the past. At a small family gathering, Teresa's mother placed a framed photo of her daughter on the mantel. "We carry her with us," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet strength. "Every day, and we always will." As the sun set over the salvage yard, its rusty skeletons bathed in a soft orange glow, it seemed to exhale a long-held breath. The secrets it held had shaped the lives of so many, leaving behind a legacy of pain, resilience, and unresolved mystery. The case of Teresa Halbach was no longer just about one woman's tragic end. It had become a reflection of humanity's desperate search for truth and justice, even when the answers seemed just out of reach. What do you think of Steven Avery and the shocking events surrounding Teresa Halbach's tragic case? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 0 to 10. What's your take on this haunting tale?